Objects, Relics and Tales from the Thomas R. Baker Museum. I'm Dr. Zack Gilmore, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Rollins, and I'm here with my co-curator, Dr. Robert Vander Poppen, who is Associate Professor of Classical Art and Archaeology. As indicated by our title, our exhibit highlights objects from the Thomas R. Baker Museum, which existed on Rollins campus between 1910 and the mid-1970s. The story of the Baker Museum, though, actually began in the very early morning hours of December 9th, 1909, when an alarm bell sounded on campus at around 2 a.m., and students spilled out of their rooms and out into the open to find that Knowles Hall, one of the largest buildings on campus at that time, was completely engulfed in flames. A few hours later, the fire was out, but the building itself was reduced almost entirely to ashes. This could have been a much larger disaster because actually newspaper reports of the incident say that Pinehurst, which sat just next to Knowles, had its roof on fire briefly before students jumped in with hoses and buckets to actually extinguish the flames. But the loss overall, because it was one of the primary academic buildings on campus. It contained the chapel, the business department, all of the science labs, classroom spaces, and a really significant collection of natural history objects that were used by the science faculty. The loss was perhaps most keenly felt by Dr. Thomas Baker, who was responsible for amassing that collection and used it extensively in his own research and teaching. However, by January of 1910, so barely a month after the fire, Dr. Baker and other college leaders had decided they wanted to reconstitute this collection and form a new museum on campus, one that was bigger and better than anything that existed before. And so with that goal in mind, they began sending out posters and newspaper ads and letters to individuals and institutions around the country requesting donations of museum quality specimens of almost any type to help constitute this new museum. And people around the country responded really generously, so that pretty quickly the collection overall had grown to more than 20,000 individual objects. These formed the basis of the new Thomas R. Baker Museum of Natural History, which was housed in Knowles Hall 2, which was a building constructed in 1910 at the location that currently holds Olin Library. The museum remained in that building until 1970, when a decision was made to pack up all the collections and move them into storage. The artifacts included in this exhibit represent just a small fraction of the original Baker Museum collection. But even so, they span 5 continents and more than 5,000 years of the human past. And as far as we can tell, none of them have been on exhibit since the closure of the Baker Museum in the 1970s. The title of our exhibit, Storied Objects, reflects a decision we made early in the planning process that we weren't going to focus entirely on the aesthetics of the objects on display or their original cultural meanings, but we really wanted to dig a little deeper into the longer-term stories that they could help tell, and especially their connection to Rollins as an institution. And so that led to an explicit focus on questions of provenance. Where did artifacts originate? How were they collected? Who was involved? And perhaps most importantly, under what circumstances did they actually come to Rollins? In the end, we decided to organize the exhibition around the artifact donors, the people actually responsible for transferring the artifacts to the Baker Museum. And fortunately for us, these donors included a really fascinating cast of characters, all of whose paths converged at Rollins during a really critical early period of the college's history. We also wanted to draw attention to the vastly different ethical standards surrounding artifact collection and museum work in general that existed when this collection was being assembled. We hope that this exhibition can help spark some meaningful conversations about the colonial legacies of many museum collections, including some really important ones, and how we can be better, more ethical stewards of these collections moving forward. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Vander Poppen, who's going to tell us about one of our most interesting donors in the collection.
All right. So I'm going to focus first on one of the donors associated with the Baker Project, and this is an individual named Edgar Banks. And Banks had this real sort of world man of mystery persona about him. He was a U.S. diplomat. He was a consul stationed in Constantinople. He was a director of the University of Chicago Oriental Institute's excavations in Iraq. And so he was somebody that was an international figure in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Banks, after he got done excavating, came back to the U.S. and saw it as his mission to get cuneiform texts, evidence of early writing, into the hands of universities and museum collections throughout the U.S., essentially so that Americans could see these new civilizations that were being unearthed in the Near East, adding thousands of years to what was known about human history. And so when we focus on Banks, Banks made connections with Rollins, largely during the period of the second quarter of the 20th century, where he fell into contact with a professor named Edwin Grover, who was the professor of the book here at Rollins. Rollins had these delightful titles for professors back in the day, and Grover's title was Professor of the Book. And that meant that he was a professor of anything that involved writing and literature. And so cuneiform tablets fell into his purview. And Grover purchased a number of cuneiform tablets specifically for the Rollins archives, and some of them still sit over there in the Rollins archives. Upon Grover's death, the remainder of his collection of cuneiform tablets winds up coming into the Baker Museum. And I'd really like to highlight how it is that he makes a connection with the Baker Museum. So Banks retires to Eustis, Florida, and living in the area, he and his wife, Minia Banks, decide to send their daughter to Rollins. Their daughter, Daphne Banks, is a fixture here on campus. And while she's here in the late 30s and early 40s, Daphne becomes a prominent figure involved in the art department. And running the art department at that time was an individual who would become a future Rollins president, Hugh McCain. Daphne's family underwent some financial hardships, as many people did in the end of the 1930s. And we wind up in a situation where Daphne asked to be excused of a work-study assignment, basically. And the college never sought to have the monies associated with that excusal repaid. In other words, they offered her a loan, didn't ask for it to be repaid, helped the family get through this tough financial circumstance. In 1954, Minia Banks reconnected with Hugh McCain, who their daughter had worked with while she was here on campus, and Minia decided that the now deceased Edgar's collection would be best served being on the campus where Daphne had worked in the art department for so many years and had made relationships with Hugh McCain. And so we get a significant collection of artifacts from Banks's travels, his personal collection, including a pair of cuneiform cones that bear, one of them, a Near Eastern peace treaty. We have a door knocker from Pompeii in the very back. And in the next case over, we have an assortment of antiquities from the late period and Ptolemaic period, primarily from Egypt, that formed Edgar's personal collection, and that Minia Banks decided were doing a lot more good in the Baker Museum than they were sitting in the Banks' attic after Edgar passed.
Right. Yet another story revealed by the Baker Museum collection is that of the early history of the Smithsonian Institution. In 1879, the Smithsonian created the Bureau of American Ethnology as a section of the museum that was charged with consolidating American anthropological research and, more importantly, collecting as much information as possible about Native American cultures, which it was widely and of course erroneously assumed at the time were doomed to disappear sooner rather than later. And so over a period of 2 decades at the end of the 19th century, the first director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, John Wesley Powell, dispatched ethnographers and archaeologists around the country to different indigenous communities and tasked them with gathering cultural data and artifacts that could be held in perpetuity at the Smithsonian. These anthropologists were in some ways too successful because as collections grew at the Smithsonian, they quickly grew out of space to hold them, and so a tradition developed of actually gifting specimens to other universities and museums, sometimes in exchange for political or financial considerations. So in 1926, with help of a little pressure from then U.S. Senator from Florida, Duncan Fletcher, a collection of 32 Native American objects was transferred from the Smithsonian to the Baker Museum. And we have a few of those objects on display here. One that I'd like to highlight is this small ceramic owl figurine, which dates to the 1870s. This artifact was collected by Matilda Cox Stevenson, who was a really well-known 19th century anthropologist, and in fact the very first woman anthropologist ever employed by the U.S. government. Over the course of her career, Stevenson was responsible for a number of pioneering ethnographic studies of Native Americans, and she was eventually elected the first president of the Women's Anthropological Society of America. And in 1879, she secured a large collection of Zuni pottery on behalf of the Bureau of American Ethnology during a multi-year expedition to the American Southwest. And this small owl is one of those specimens that she collected at that time. It's a really early example of a common and still produced Zuni ceramic form, and this owl form has in some ways become sort of the iconic symbol of traditional Zuni pottery making. The Bureau also frequently purchased Native American artifacts from collectors, and one example of that is this Sioux ceremonial headdress, which is composed of skunk skin and horsehair that was tightly woven together and dyed various really bright, brilliant colors. Headdresses of this type, which are sometimes called roaches, were worn exclusively by male warriors and dancers, often in the context of actual battles. This particular example was purchased by the Smithsonian from Indian art collector and U.S. Army officer George Cook in 1892. It was acquired as part of a much larger collection that was intended for exhibition at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which is, interestingly, an event sort of infamous for its display of not only cultural curiosities, but also actual living indigenous people from around North America.
Our last story that we'd like to tell tonight regarding Magic Objects focuses on this series of objects that we have in the central case here in the exhibition. And the central case contains a number of chippings, a number of fragments of monuments collected over approximately a 50-year span by a traveler named Charles McCormick Reeves. We talked about how some of this exhibition is focused on different collection standards than are present today and different ethical standards that are present today. And each of the canisters here, labeled by Reeves himself, represents a chipping that came from a famous monument or a tangible souvenir of a historical event that Reeves was part of. For example, if we take a look at Reeves' early travels to Italy, we have here in our fourth canister, here, the one right in the center, we've got a mosaic tessera that comes from the Palatine Hill in Rome, from the Palace of the Caesars. Reeves was traveling in the early 20th century when this was standard practice to gain souvenirs from these archaeological sites. We would never do that today. It's not something that's legally allowed, and it's not something that people should be doing today. But at the early 20th century and late 19th century, this was a regular practice of high-profile international travelers. And so as a result, we have the souvenirs of Reeves' travels. And Reeves was an early international traveler. He accompanied the 1870 Yale expedition that went to the West, searching for geological specimens and exploring the not yet designated Yosemite National Park in the company of figures like Wild Bill Cody. In addition, What you're looking at now are a series of canisters that pertain to a diplomatic and humanitarian mission that Reeves was part of, a mission that sought to alleviate the Russian famine that occurred in 1892. So an interventionary expedition that Reeves was part of, where Reeves and a number of others enlisted subscriptions for millers in Nebraska and Minnesota in order to send food aid into Russia. His quasi-diplomatic status allowed him to go into places that normal folks didn't get access to, and he winds up collecting a number of souvenirs associated with Russia and with the Prussian Empire, such as, for example, here we have from the Palace of Sanssouci, clippings from Voltaire's paper basket. So these little tangible commemorations of Reeves' journeys. Now, how is it that Reeves connects with Rollins? Reeves retires here in Winter Park, and Reeves, being a Yale graduate, connected with one of the most famous figures in Rollins lore. He connected with President Hamilton Holt, who was also a Yale graduate. And the years where Reeves lived here in Winter Park were years where he continued to have this warm friendship with Hamilton Holt. And when Reeves passed at 100 years old in 1947, Reeves donated his collection to the Baker Museum. I want to highlight with this collection that we have here the fact that this is not merely an exhibition that Professor Gilmore and I collaborated on, but it's an exhibit that we collaborated on with a series of students. And I want to thank wholeheartedly the students from the public archaeology anthropology class, the digital archaeology class in art history, and also the museum methods class in art history, who helped to provide some of the background research on the objects that you're seeing today. And I think Zack is going to tell us as well about the last of the connections on campus of others who contributed to the exhibition.
Sure. I would definitely like to thank all of the staff here at the museum that helped us put this this exhibit together, and also the staff at the Olin Library Archives. Our students spent countless hours in the archives doing research that couldn't have happened without the help of the very generous staff at the archives. And yeah, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge their help and then their contributions to this exhibit.
And then we have a couple of questions from some of our viewers. The first one comes from Nolan McCormick, and his question is in reference to the snakeskin and horsehair headdress. How does preservation for this kind of organic material work?
So this is the headdress is a piece that wouldn't typically survive archaeologically. Right? It's entirely organic. It would last almost no time in the soil. Thankfully, when this object was collected, it was collected as an ethnographic item. It was purchased, or I'm actually not sure of the circumstances of the collection, from the Sioux people, but it was collected from them directly. And so preservation hasn't been an issue because it's been stored in climate-controlled conditions and acid-free boxes in the museum since then. Moving forward, it's a piece that you definitely want to take some really serious precautions to keep it in its current condition. But it's one that is very secure at the museum.
And then we have a couple of the comments if you guys would like to comment as well on. We comment on the comments. For Rachel Walton, we have regarding the Indian provenance, it is questionable and troublesome aspect, and definitely not a new thing. Not in museums and not in archives either.
Yeah. I think Rachel's right to highlight issues of provenance, and this is something that everyone who works in cultural property is dealing with here in the 21st century. The standards have changed so much from the 19th century to what the practices are today, and they've been codified in law, for example, in the UNESCO Treaty on Cultural Heritage. And there was really no uniform set of practices prior to some of those international agreements, and museums and cultural institutions are wrestling with what standards they should hold themselves to with this material, and archives wrestling with the same thing.
Right, and that's why I think it's important to focus explicitly on provenance. Many very large, very famous institutions around the world have been criticized for displaying objects just for themselves, right, as shiny objects to go and see, rather than really digging into where the objects came from, how they were acquired, who was marginalized in the process. And so, just to reiterate what Dr. Vander Poppen said, this is a collection that couldn't have been assembled recently, legally or ethically. And so I think by displaying these artifacts now, we can really dig into the issues of why that is, why the standards have changed, and how we can operate more ethically in the future.
Okay, we can wrap it up.
All right, well, if you'd like to come see the exhibit, it will be up through December. And so if you want to come, it's free. At this point, you do need to log on to the Cornell Fine Arts Museum website, and please register for time slots due to the coronavirus precautions that are being taken right now. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us tonight.